Found inside a hollow tree after 24 years, what they discovered is chilling. The air in Whisperwood was always thick with secrets. But on that suffocating August afternoon, it felt different. It felt heavy, like a lung full of water. 2 boys, Leo and Sam, no older than 12, were chasing a stray drone that had defied its controller. Its buzzing whine, a frantic insect sound against the ancient quiet of the forest. They were city kids, visiting grandparents, and the woods were a sprawling, untamed playground. The drone, a cheap plastic thing, finally sputtered and died, its red light winking out before it tumbled into the gnarled arms of a colossal oak tree, one so old and wide it was known to the local kids as the Hollow Giant. "Great," Sam panted, hands on his knees. "Just great, Dad's gonna kill me." Leo, ever the optimist, was already craning his neck. "It's not that high, I can see it. It's stuck on a branch near that big hole." The hole was a dark, gaping maw in the trunk, about 20 feet up. It looked like a wound, a place where lightning had long ago torn the tree open, but the bark had healed around it into a smooth, lipless scar. The drone was just above it, snagged and pitiful. "No way I'm climbing that," Sam said, eyeing the thick poisony-veiled vines that clung to the bark. "You don't have to," Leo said, a glint of bravado in his eyes. "I will." He was a natural climber, wiry and fearless. He found handholds in the rough bark and used the thickest vines like a ladder, his sneakers finding purchase where Sam saw none. He moved with a practiced grace, ignoring Sam's anxious calls from below. As he neared the hole, the smell hit him. It wasn't the usual scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. This was a smell that was sharp and wrong, a sickly sweet odor that clung to the back of his throat. It was the smell of something that had been left in the dark for a very, very long time. "Leo, you got it?" Sam yelled up, almost. Leo called back, his voice strained. He reached for the drone, his fingers just brushing its plastic shell. He stretched, his body arching away from the trunk, and to get a better angle, he braced his foot against the edge of the hollow. That's when the wood gave way. It wasn't a loud crack, but a soft crumbling sound, like rotted cork. His foot plunged into the darkness of the hollow, and for a terrifying second, he dangled, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scrambled back, pulling his leg out, his shins scraped and bleeding. But it wasn't the pain that made him scream. It was what came out with his foot. A cascade of small, brittle objects tumbled from the hole, clattering down the bark and landing in the mulch below. They were pale, almost white, and strangely shaped. One of them, a long, slender piece, rolled to a stop right by Sam's shoe. He bent down, his face a mask of confusion. It was a bone, a human bone. Leo's scream was a raw, primal thing that ripped through the forest's silence. He didn't stop screaming as he scrambled down the tree, sliding the last 10 feet and landing in a heap, his eyes wide with a horror that no 12-year-old should ever know. He pointed a trembling finger back at the hole. There's someone in there," he choked out, his voice a ragged whisper. "A whole person." By the time Sheriff Brody arrived, the scene was cordoned off with yellow tape. The stark, artificial color an insult to the deep greens and browns of the woods. The boys were with their parents, wrapped in blankets, despite the heat, their faces pale and shell-shocked. Brody, a man whose weary face had been carved by 2 decades of small-town dramas, felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He'd been sheriff here in Harmony Creek for 24 years. He knew these woods, he knew their secrets. But this felt different. The forensics team was already at work, their white suits ghostly against the backdrop of the ancient trees. A ladder was propped against the Hollow Giant, and a young deputy, pale under his freckles, was carefully pulling more remains from the cavity. He'd place each piece into a sterile bag with a reverence that was both professional and deeply human. Brody watched, his jaw tight. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, who was in that tree. He'd known it the second the call came in. A hollow tree, human remains. It was a ghost story, a local legend that had haunted this town for nearly a quarter of a century. A story he had tried, and failed to bury. "Anything else in there, Miller?" Brody called up, his voice rough. Deputy Miller leaned his head out of the hollow, his mask fogging. It's a mess, Sheriff. But there's fabric, scraps of it, looks like a dress. Floral pattern, maybe. And this," he held up a small, tarnished object in his gloved hand. It was a silver locket, heart-shaped. Brody's breath hitched. He didn't need to see it up close. He knew the delicate etching of the single rose on its surface. He had held it in his own hands once, a lifetime ago. The discovery was the lead story on the evening news. The reporter, a young woman with sharp eyes and a sharper ambition, stood in front of the taped-off woods, her voice grave. "A gruesome discovery in the quiet town of Harmony Creek today, as the skeletal remains of an unidentified person were found inside a hollow tree. Sources say the remains could be decades old, potentially linked to one of the town's most infamous cold cases. In a pristine, white-walled house on the other side of town, a woman named Eleanor Vance watched the broadcast. Her hand frozen on its way to her mouth, a porcelain teacup rattling in its saucer. Her face, a carefully maintained mask of placid elegance, began to crack. The locket. They had found the locket. Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened around the delicate cup, and with a sharp crack, it shattered. Hot tea and ceramic shards spilling across the polished mahogany of her coffee table. She didn't flinch. Her gaze was fixed on the screen, on the image of the hollow giant, a dark monument to a secret she had carried like a stone in her gut for 24 years. The reporter continued. Her voice a somber drone. "The disappearance of 17-year-old Lily Calloway in the summer of 1999 has long haunted this community. She vanished without a trace after the annual Founders' Day picnic, held just a mile from where these remains were discovered. Now, authorities are faced with the chilling possibility that they have finally found her. In a small, cluttered apartment above a dusty bookstore, a man named Thomas lived surrounded by the ghosts of words. He was a writer, or he had been, once. Now, he was just a man who drank too much and slept too little." The news was a low murmur from a small television in the corner, a sound he usually ignored. But the name Lily Calloway cut through the haze of his whiskey-soaked stupor. He sat up, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked at his hands, at the faint silvery scars that traced their way across his knuckles. He remembered the feel of bark under his fingernails, the scent of rain and fear, the splintering sound of a promise being broken. He had been there that night. He had seen everything, and he had said nothing. For 24 years, he had been the silent witness. His cowardice, a cancer that had eaten away at his soul. The camera zoomed in on a grainy black and white photo of Lily. She was smiling, her head tilted, a spray of freckles across her nose. She was beautiful, vibrant, a girl on the cusp of everything. A girl who had simply vanished into the humid summer air. Sheriff Brody stood at the edge of the woods as dusk began to bleed through the canopy. The forensics team was packing up, the last of the sterile white bags loaded into the van. They had recovered a nearly complete skeleton, the delicate bones of a young woman. They had found the scraps of her floral dress, the one she had been so proud of, and they had found the locket, now sealed in an evidence bag. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see his deputy. Miller, his young face etched with a weary sadness. "We found something else," Sheriff Miller said, his voice low, tucked deep inside the hollow, beneath everything else. It was wrapped in oilcloth. He handed Brody a larger evidence bag. Inside was a small leather-bound journal. Its cover was warped and stained, but it was intact. Brody took it, his hands surprisingly steady. He could see the faint gold-embossed initials on the cover. L.C. Lily's diary. A cold dread, colder than any fear he had ever known, washed over him. This wasn't just a body anymore. This was a voice. A voice that had been silenced for 24 years. A voice that was about to speak from the grave. And he knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that it was a voice that would tear this town, and his own life, apart. He looked from the diary to the hollow giant. Its dark opening now, a screaming mouth against the twilight sky. The secrets of Whisperwood were not just heavy anymore. They were about to become a flood, and he was standing at the epicenter of the deluge. The case he had buried, the case that had defined his career and his conscience, was not only reopened, it was about to explode. The ground beneath his feet, the very foundation of the life he had built, felt as rotten and hollow as the tree that had held its terrible secret for so long. The shock was just the beginning. The real devastation was yet to come. He knew what he had to do. He had to read it. He had to face the words she had left behind. Words that would either confirm his darkest suspicions or unleash a new, unimagined horror. He walked back to his cruiser, the leather of the diary cool, and, heavy in his hand, a testament to the weight of the past. The quiet of Harmony Creek was a lie. It had always been a lie. And now, the silence was about to be shattered by the ghost of a girl who had finally, terribly, come home. The cliffhanger wasn't just about what was in the diary, it was about what he, Sheriff Brody, would do once he knew. The injustice had been allowed to fester for too long. Now, it was a wound that had turned septic, and the poison was about to spill out. The summer of 1999 was a sweltering honey season in Harmony Creek. It was the summer Lily Calloway turned 17, the summer her laughter was the unofficial soundtrack to the long lazy days. Lily was not just a girl. She was a current of energy, a flash of bright, unapologetic life in a town that often felt muted and grey. Her hair was the color of wild honey, and her eyes were a startling shade of green, flecked with gold like sunlight through leaves. She was the daughter of the town doctor, a fact that afforded her a certain status, but she wore it lightly, with an easy grace that drew people to her. She worked part-time at the local diner, the Sip and Spoon, where she knew everyone's order by heart and could coax a smile out of the town's grumpiest old-timers. Her dream was to be a writer, to fill notebooks with stories and poems, to see the world beyond the suffocating familiarity of Harmony Creek. Her diary, the one now sitting in an evidence bag on Sheriff Brody's desk, was her most prized possession. A secret world where she could be completely, unreservedly herself. Her best friend, Thomas, was her shadow, her confidant, her opposite. Where Lily was bright, Thomas was quiet. Where she was bold, he was hesitant. He was the son of the town librarian, a boy who lived more in the pages of books than in the world outside. He was hopelessly, silently in love with her, a fact so obvious to everyone but Lily herself. He was a lanky, awkward boy with a shock of dark hair that was always falling into his eyes and a habit of looking at his feet when he spoke. But when he was with Lily, he was different. She saw the wit and the kindness and the fierce loyalty that he kept hidden from the rest of the world. They spent their days by the creek, skipping stones and sharing secrets, their futures stretching out before them like an unwritten page. He was going to be a great novelist, she declared, and she would be his editor. They had it all planned out. But there was another shadow in Lily's life, one that was long and cold and cast by the imposing figure of Richard Vance. Richard was the town's golden boy, the heir to the Vance family fortune built on the lumber mill that had been the town's lifeblood for generations. He was handsome, charismatic, and possessed a chilling sense of entitlement. He drove a gleaming black convertible, and his smile, which could charm the birds from the trees, never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was a few years older than Lily, home from his first year at an Ivy League college, and he had decided, with the unshakable certainty of a man who had never been denied anything, that he wanted her. Lily was flattered at first. Richard was a world away from the shy, fumbling boys of Harmony Creek. He bought her expensive gifts, took her to fancy restaurants in the city, and spoke of a life of travel and excitement, a life that mirrored the one she dreamed of in her diary. But there was a darkness to him, a possessiveness that began to suffocate her. He hated when she spent time with Thomas, his charm curdling into a quiet, menacing jealousy. He would grip her arm just a little too tightly, his voice dropping to a low, insistent whisper when she disagreed with him. "You're mine, Lily," he would say, not as a term of endearment, but as a statement of fact. a declaration of ownership. The brokenness in Lily's past was a quiet hairline fracture. Her father, Dr. Calloway, was a good man, but a distant one, consumed by his work and the lingering grief of losing his wife to cancer years earlier. He saw Lily's vibrance, but didn't see the subtle dimming of her light as the summer wore on. He saw Richard Vance as a promising match, a connection to the most powerful family in town, and he dismissed Lily's growing unease as teenage melodrama. "Give him a chance, sweetheart," he'd say, patting her hand. "He's a Vance. He'll take care of you." Richard's past was a different story, a tapestry of secrets woven by his mother, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was the matriarch of Harmony Creek, a woman who ruled the town's social scene with an iron will and a serene, unreadable smile. She had sculpted her son in her own image, teaching him that power was everything and that the rules that applied to other people did not apply to them. She had covered up his youthful transgressions, a drunk driving incident, a fight that left another boy with a broken jaw, with a quiet phone call and a generous donation to the right charity. She saw Lily not as a person, but as an accessory, a suitable, pretty addition to the Vance dynasty. But when she sensed Lily's hesitation, her independent spirit, she saw a threat. A loose thread that could unravel everything she had so carefully built. Thomas's wound was his silence. He saw the way Richard looked at Lily, the way his ownership disguised itself as affection. He saw the bruises, faint and thumb-shaped, that Lily tried to cover with her sleeves. He saw the fear that flickered in her eyes when Richard's car pulled up outside the diner. He wanted to scream, to tell her to run, to tell her father what was happening. But he was just Thomas, the quiet, bookish boy, who would believe him. Over Richard Vance, the town's prince, his fear and his love warred within him, and fear won. He stayed silent, and his silence became a betrayal. A heavy cloak he would wear for the next 24 years. The Founders' Day picnic was the climax of the summer. The day the entire town gathered in the sprawling meadow by Whisperwood Forest. The air was thick with the smell of barbecue and freshly cut grass. Lily was there, wearing a new floral sundress, a gift from Richard. He was by her side constantly, his arm draped possessively around her shoulders. She looked beautiful, but her smile was brittle, her eyes scanning the crowd, searching for Thomas. She found him near the edge of the woods, sitting alone under a large oak. She made an excuse and slipped away from Richard, her heart pounding, with a desperate need to talk to him, to the one person who felt like home. "Tommy," she said, her voice a rush of relief. "I need to talk to you." He looked up, his face a mixture of love and pain. "What's wrong, Lil?" "It's Richard," she whispered, her gaze darting back towards the picnic. "I'm going to end it. Tonight, I can't do this anymore. He scares me." The words hung in the air between them, the confession he had been waiting for and dreading all summer. Before he could respond, Richard was there, his shadow falling over them. "What are you two whispering about?" he asked, his voice deceptively light. His eyes, however, were chips of ice. "Nothing," Lily said quickly, standing up. "We were just talking." "It didn't look like nothing," Richard said, his gaze fixed on Thomas, a look of pure contempt on his face. He grabbed Lily's arm. "We're leaving." "No," Lily said, her voice shaking but firm. She pulled her arm away. "Not going anywhere with you, Richard. We're done." For a moment, Richard's charming mask fell away completely, revealing the raw, ugly rage beneath. His face contorted, and for a terrifying second, Thomas thought he was going to strike her right there, in front of everyone. But then, with a visible effort, he reined it in. His expression smoothed over, and he even managed a small, tight smile. "Don't be dramatic, darling," he said, his voice once again smooth as silk. "You're just upset. Let's go for a walk, we'll talk it over. In the woods, it's quieter there." He gestured towards the darkening path that led into Whisperwood. Lily hesitated, her eyes pleading with Thomas. "Don't let me go with him." The message was unspoken but clear. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. This was his moment. This was his chance to be the hero, to stand up and say no, to protect her. But he looked at Richard Vance, at his size, his confidence, the aura of untouchable power that surrounded him. And he looked at himself, a boy of books and quiet corners. The fear was a physical thing, a hand squeezing his throat, stealing his voice. "Go on, Lily," Thomas heard himself say, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It's okay, just talk to him." The betrayal in Lily's eyes was a wound that would never heal. It was a look of such profound disappointment, of such utter abandonment, that it would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. She held his gaze for a moment longer, a silent, damning judgment. And then she turned and walked away, following Richard down the path into the growing darkness of Whisper. Thomas stood there, paralyzed by his own cowardice, as their figures disappeared among the trees. He told himself it would be fine. They would talk, she would come back, and everything would be okay. But a cold, sick feeling coiled in his stomach. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had let her walk into the dark with the monster, and he had done nothing. Lily Calloway was never seen again. The initial search was frantic and widespread, led by a younger, less weary Sheriff Brody. Richard Vance was questioned, of course. He was calm, collected, devastated. He told Brody that they had argued, that Lily had been emotional and had run off into the woods, insisting she needed to be alone. He had waited, he said, calling her name, but she never came back. He had assumed she had gone home. Her anger cooled. His story was plausible, his grief convincing. Eleanor Vance stood by his side, her presence a silent, powerful endorsement of his innocence. There was no evidence of foul play, no witnesses to their argument, nothing but the word of a scared, heartbroken boy against that of the town's most prominent family. Thomas was questioned too. He was a wreck, consumed by guilt and fear. He told the sheriff that he had seen them walk into the woods together. He wanted to say more, to tell them about the fear in Lily's eyes, about the bruises, about Richard's rage. But the Vance's lawyer was present, a shark in a tailored suit, and Thomas's courage failed him again. He mumbled that they had been arguing, but that it was probably just a lover's quarrel. He downplayed it. He lied by omission. And with that, he sealed Lily's fate and his own. The search was eventually scaled back. The town grieved, whispered, and then, slowly, moved on. Life continued, paving over the raw, open wound of Lily's disappearance. Richard Vance went back to college, graduated with honors, and returned to Harmony Creek to take over the family business, becoming a pillar of the community, a man respected and admired. Thomas fled, escaping to a city where no one knew his name, trying to outrun the ghost of the girl he had betrayed. He tried to write, but the only story he had to tell was the one he couldn't bring himself to put on paper. And, in the heart of Whisperwood, the hollow giant kept its secret. The seasons turned, the years passed, and the memory of Lily Calloway faded from a raw wound to a faint, silvery scar on the town's collective memory. A ghost story told by kids, a sad, unsolved mystery. But for 3 people, a powerful mother, a silent witness, and a small-town sheriff who had never stopped believing it was murder, the past was never dead. It was just waiting, biding its time in the dark, silent heart of a hollow tree. The discovery of the bones wasn't just about finding a body. It was about resurrecting a history that had been deliberately, brutally buried. The characters had been introduced to the world, their secrets and wounds laid bare. The stage was now set for the conflict to begin, for the carefully constructed lies of 24 years to start to crumble under the weight of a truth that refused to stay buried. The discovery of Lily's remains sent a tremor through Harmony Creek, cracking the placid surface of the town's carefully cultivated peace. For Sheriff Brody, it was the beginning of a war he had been waiting 24 years to fight. The leather-bound diary sat on his desk, a ticking time bomb. He spent the first night reading it under the harsh fluorescent lights of his office, the coffee going cold in his mug. Lily's voice, so full of life and hope, and then, increasingly, of fear, filled the sterile room. She wrote about her dreams, her arguments with her father, her love for Thomas's quiet soul. And she wrote about Richard. July 12th, Richard gave me a beautiful pearl necklace today. He clasped it around my neck and said, "So everyone knows you belong to me." He smiled when he said it, but his eyes were like a winter sky. It didn't feel like a gift, it felt like a collar. August 2nd, we had a fight. I wanted to go to the movies with Sarah, and he got so angry. He said I didn't need other friends when I had him. He grabbed my wrist. There's a mark there now, a faint purple shadow. I told Dad I bumped into a door. I feel so stupid, and so scared. August 20th, I saw Tommy today. I wanted to tell him everything, to just cry and let him hold me and tell me I'm not crazy. But I couldn't. Richard was watching. He's always watching. I feel like I'm in a cage, and the bars are getting closer every day. I have to get out. I'm going to tell him it's over at the picnic. I have to. I'll ask Tommy to be there. He'll make me brave. Brody's hands clenched as he read the last entry, written on the morning of the Founders' Day picnic. The words were a gut punch, a testament to a terror he had only suspected. This diary was the evidence he had never had. It was motive. It was a portrait of abuse. But it wasn't proof of murder. His first move was to bring Richard Vance in for questioning. The news of the discovery had already spread, and when Brody's cruiser pulled up to the sprawling Vance estate, Richard was waiting on the porch, his face a mask of somber concern. He was in his mid-40s now, his youthful charisma hardened into an aura of sleek, untouchable power. He was flanked by his lawyer, the same shark in a more expensive suit. "Sheriff," Richard said, his voice smooth and grave. "This is a terrible tragedy. We're all devastated. Poor Lily, after all these years." "We need you to come down to the station, Richard," Brody said, his voice flat. "Just to go over your statement from 1999. In the interrogation room, Richard was the picture of composure. He recounted the same story he had told 24 years ago, his voice filled with a carefully rehearsed sorrow. The argument, her running off his desperate calls into the woods. He expressed shock and horror that she had been in that tree the whole time. "If I had known, if I had any idea, I would have torn that forest apart with my bare hands." Brody let him talk. Let him spin his web of lies. Then he slid the evidence bag containing the diary across the table. "We found this with the body, Richard. It's Lily's diary." For the first time, a flicker of something not fear, but pure, cold fury flashed in Richard's eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a look of pained confusion. His lawyer immediately interjected. "My client will not be answering any questions about some supposed diary, a document of questionable authenticity found after 2.5 decades. She writes about you, Richard," Brody pressed, his voice low and dangerous. "She writes about being afraid of you. She writes about the bruises. She writes that she was going to break up with you that night." Richard leaned forward, his mask of grief replaced by one of condescending pity. "Sheriff, with all due respect, she was a dramatic 17-year-old girl. We had a passionate relationship. We argued. It's all there in my original statement. To twist a teenage girl's diary into an accusation of murder is not only desperate, it's insulting to her memory." His cruelty was breathtaking. He was using Lily's own words, her own fear, to paint her as unstable, to dismiss her as a hysterical girl. Brody felt a surge of rage so hot it almost choked him. He knew he had nothing that would stick. The diary was powerful, but it wasn't a confession. Richard Vance walked out of the station that day, a free man, a grieving former lover in the eyes of the public, leaving Brody with nothing but the bitter taste of impotent fury. The injustice escalated with brutal speed. The Vances went on the offensive. Eleanor, a master of public relations and quiet manipulation, began to shape the narrative. She gave an exclusive interview to a national news network, her eyes welling with tears as she spoke of her son's enduring heartbreak. She spoke of Lily's troubled spirit, hinting at a history of emotional instability that never existed. She funded the creation of the Lily Calloway Memorial Scholarship, a gesture of stunning, cynical hypocrisy that painted the Vances as benevolent patrons of the town's grief. They were not just denying the crime, they were copting the victim, twisting her memory into a shield for her killer. For Thomas, the news of the discovery was a summons from a past he had never truly escaped. He saw Lily's face on the television, and the guilt that had been his constant companion for 24 years became an active, tormenting presence. He started drinking more heavily, the whiskey a temporary anesthetic for a soul-deep wound. He saw Richard Vance on the news, looking polished and powerful, and he felt a surge of sickness and self-loathing. One evening, a sleek black car pulled up outside his bookstore. A man in a tailored suit got out and entered the shop. It wasn't the lawyer. This man was different. His smile was thin, and his eyes were empty. He worked for the Vances, he said. A consultant. Mr. Miller, the man said, his voice soft and unnervingly friendly. Thomas hadn't used his real last name in years. Mrs. Vance is aware that you and Lily were close. She knows you were questioned back in the day. She just wants to ensure that everyone's memories of that tragic time are consistent. It would be a shame for old, unreliable recollections to cause any more pain for the families involved. It wasn't a question. It was a threat, delivered with the casual menace of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He placed a thick envelope on the counter. Mrs. Vance is also aware of your financial difficulties. She's a very generous woman. She hopes this will help you get back on your feet. Thomas stared at the envelope, his heart pounding. It was hush money. A down payment on his continued silence. The man's message was clear. Stay quiet, and your problems disappear. Speak up, and we will make your life a living hell. The Vances weren't just covering their tracks. They were actively, aggressively, burying the truth, and they were trying to make him an accomplice. The fear he had felt as a 17-year-old boy came rushing back. But this time, it was different. It was mingled with a white-hot rage. They thought they could buy him, that his silence had a price tag. He looked at the man's empty eyes and saw the same soullessness he had seen in Richard's all those years ago. Get out, Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. The man's smile didn't waver. I think you'll reconsider. He tapped the envelope. Think it over. He turned and walked out, leaving the envelope on the counter, a toxic temptation. Thomas was trapped. His conscience, awakened from its long, drunken slumber, screamed at him to go to the sheriff, to tell him everything. But the Vances' power was immense. They had just threatened him in his own home. What would they do if he actually spoke out? They could ruin him, discredit him, make him seem like an opportunistic liar. They could hurt him. He was terrified. The struggle within him was a vicious, tearing conflict. His fear of the Vances warred with his guilt over Lily, his desire for self-preservation, clashing with his desperate need for redemption. The pressure on Brody was mounting from all sides. The state police were getting involved, and his superiors were pushing him to either make an arrest or declare it a cold case once and for all. The media was portraying him as a small-town sheriff on a personal vendetta against a respected local family. The town itself was divided. Some whispered their suspicions, remembering Richard's temper, but many more, swayed by the Vances' money and influence, saw Brody as the one disrupting the peace. The cruelty of the Vances became bolder. They petitioned the court to have Lily's remains released to them for burial. She was like a daughter to us, Eleanor claimed in a press release. A statement of such audacious falsehood that it made Brody physically ill. They were trying to steal her, to own her in death, as Richard had tried to own her in life. They wanted to bury her and her secrets in a plot in the Vance family cemetery, a final triumphant act of possession. Brody fought it, arguing that the remains were part of an active murder investigation, but the Vances' lawyers were skilled. They painted Brody as obsessive, as a man unable to let go of a decades-old tragedy. And they painted the Vances as a grieving family seeking closure. The judge, a man who played golf with Richard Vance every other weekend, was sympathetic to their plea. The day the judge was set to rule on the motion, Brody felt a desperate, suffocating sense of defeat. He was losing. The truth was being systematically dismantled, repackaged, and sold as a lie, and the system was helping them do it. He sat in his office, staring at the evidence board, at Lily's smiling face, at the picture of the locket, at the photocopied pages of her diary. He had all the pieces, but he couldn't make them fit in a way the law would recognize. The injustice was a physical weight, pressing down on him, and the tension was becoming unbearable. He was failing her. After 24 years, he was failing her all over again. The conflict had escalated, the antagonist was winning, and the witness was paralyzed by fear. The whole town was a pressure cooker, and the lid was about to blow. Thomas spent 3 days in a whiskey-fueled haze, the Vance's envelope sitting on his counter like a venomous snake. He'd pick it up, feel its weight, and then throw it back down in disgust. It was a lifeline and a death sentence all at once. His mind was a battlefield. Lily's disappointed face, as she walked into the woods, fought with the consultant's dead-eyed smile. His guilt fought with his terror. He was trapped in the same paralysis that had stolen his voice 24 years ago. He was a coward then, and he was a coward now. The thought was a shard of glass in his gut. On the 4th night, unable to sleep, he began to tear his small apartment apart. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Absolution? A sign. He just needed to do something, anything, to quiet the screaming. In his head, he pulled out dusty boxes from the back of his closet. Boxes he hadn't opened since he'd fled Harmony Creek. They were filled with the detritus of his former life, old books, college papers, forgotten photographs. In the bottom of one box, beneath a stack of rejection letters from publishers, his fingers brushed against something hard and rectangular. He pulled it out. It was a small black cassette tape in a clear plastic case. There was no label. He stared at it, his heart beginning to pound. He hadn't owned a cassette player in 15 years. He vaguely remembered making mixtapes for Lily, but this wasn't one of them. This was something else. A memory, foggy and suppressed, began to surface. The summer of '99, he had bought a microcassette recorder, a cheap, handheld device. He had fancied himself a writer, and he'd started carrying it around, recording snippets of conversation, sounds of the town, thinking it would add authenticity to his future novels. It was a pretentious, silly habit, one he'd forgotten completely. His hands shaking, he raced out of his apartment and down the street to the 24-hour pawn shop. The old man behind the counter gave him a strange look as Thomas, wild-eyed and reeking of whiskey, frantically searched the shelves. He found it in a dusty bin of old electronics, a clunky beige cassette player. He paid for it with the last $20 in his pocket and ran back to his apartment, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He fumbled with the tape, his fingers clumsy. He jammed it into the player, snapped the lid shut, and pressed the play button. The speakers hissed with static. He heard the faint chirping of crickets, the distant sound of music and laughter, the Founders' Day picnic. And then, he heard his own voice, young and hesitant. ... just talk to him. The words, his great betrayal, echoed back at him from the past. A wave of nausea washed over him. He heard Lily's sharp intake of breath, and then, Richard's voice, smooth and menacing. Good boy, Tommy. You know your place. Now, let's go for that walk, darling. The sound of footsteps on dry leaves. Thomas almost stopped the tape right there. He didn't want to hear any more, but he couldn't. He had to know. He had to follow them into the dark. He must have instinctively hit the record button and dropped the recorder into his jacket pocket as he watched them go. He had followed them. He remembered it now, a memory so deeply buried in shame he hadn't accessed it in decades. He had crept after them, staying a safe distance behind, his fear warring with a desperate, belated need to make sure Lily was okay. The recording was filled with the sounds of the woods at dusk, his own ragged breathing, the snap of a twig under his shoe, and then, their voices again, clearer now. They had stopped. Lily, I mean it, Richard. It's over. I can't live like this. You can't control me, Richard, control you. I protect you. I provide for you. I give you everything. And this is how you repay me, by sneaking around with that pathetic little bookworm. Lily, Thomas is my friend. He's a good person. He's not like you. Richard, a cold, humorless laugh. Not like me. You're damn right he's not. He's weak. He's nothing. You think he would have stood up for you back there? He practically handed you over to me. Because he's scared, and he should be, you should be. The sound of a struggle, a muffled cry from Lily. Lily, let go of me. You're hurting me, Richard. You're making a scene. You always do this. You love the drama. We're going somewhere more private, somewhere we can talk this through properly. Lily, no, I'm not going anywhere with you. Someone will hear, Richard. Hear what? That you're a hysterical little bitch who doesn't know what's good for her. No one's coming, Lily. Your little friend Tommy abandoned you. Your father thinks I'm a saint. You're mine, and you're not going anywhere. The sound of him dragging her, her frantic, terrified protests. Thomas, on the tape, was silent. He was just a ghost, his cowardice a tangible presence in the rustling leaves and his own shaky breath. They were moving deeper into the woods, towards the hollow giant. Thomas remembered the tree, a place they used to play as kids. The sounds became more desperate. A slap, the sickening thud of a body hitting the ground. Lily's voice, no longer defiant, but small and broken. Lily, please, Richard, just let me go home, please, Richard, home. You are home, you're with me, you just need to learn your lesson. You need to learn that you don't say no to me. Ever, there was another sound, a sharp, cracking sound, a scream that was cut off abruptly, and then, silence. A profound, terrifying silence, broken only by the chirping of the crickets and the sound of Richard's heavy, ragged breathing. Thomas, on the tape, finally made a sound. A choked, horrified gasp. Richard's voice, sharp and suddenly close. Who's there? Is someone there? The sound of frantic rustling. Thomas was running. He was running for his life, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at his face. The sound of Richard's pursuit close behind. The tape was a cacophony of his own panicked breathing, the thud of his footsteps, and then, mercifully, the sounds of the forest faded as he broke through the tree line and back into the light of the meadow. The tape kept recording for another minute, capturing the sound of his heart hammering like a drum before it ended with a final, abrupt click. Thomas sat on the floor of his apartment, the cassette player in his lap, the world tilting on its axis. It was all there. The argument, the assault, the murder. He hadn't just been a witness from afar. He had been there. He had heard everything. He had recorded Richard Vance killing Lily Calloway. The full, horrifying conspiracy crashed down on him. He had run that night, not just from Richard, but from the truth. He had blocked it out, buried it so deep that it had become a black hole in his memory. His guilt wasn't just about his silence. It was about his flight. He had abandoned her, not once, but twice. And the Vance, their actions over the past few weeks weren't just about covering up a youthful mistake. This was a calculated, cold-blooded conspiracy that had been in place for 24 years. The hush money, the threats, the manipulation of the media, was all part of a desperate attempt to keep this tape, or the truth it contained, from ever surfacing. They knew. Eleanor must have known from the very beginning. She hadn't just protected her son. She had been his accomplice. The stakes had shifted seismically. This was no longer just about his personal pain or his private guilt. This tape was the key. It was the one thing that could cut through the Vance's money and power. It was the voice of a dead girl crying out for justice. It was a public bombshell, a scandal that would not just rock Harmony Creek, but destroy its most powerful family. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. The Vances had threatened him when they thought he was just a loose end. What would they do if they knew he held the instrument of their destruction in his hands? But for the first time in 24 years, another feeling was stronger than the fear, a burning righteous anger, an anger for Lily, an anger for the life she never got to live, an anger for the boy he should have been. He stood up, his legs steady. He picked up the cassette tape, the small black rectangle feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. He walked over to the counter and picked up the envelope of money. He tore it in half, the bills fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. He knew what he had to do. There was no more running, no more hiding. The tension that had been tearing him apart had finally snapped, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. He was going to take this tape to Sheriff Brody, and together, they were going to burn the Vance's world to the ground. The plot twist had been revealed, the hidden clue unearthed. The maximum tension was no longer about whether the truth would come out, but about the explosion it would cause when it did. Sheriff Brody was staring at the motion filed by the Vance's lawyer, a document that would give them Lily's remains, when his office door swung open. Thomas stood there, looking like a ghost from a war. He was pale, his eyes were red-rimmed, but there was a new, unfamiliar steel in his spine. He walked to Brody's desk and placed the cheap cassette player and the single black tape on the blotter. "You need to hear this," Thomas said, his voice raw but steady. "This is what happened that night." Brody looked from Thomas's haunted face to the tape. He had 100 questions, but he saw the look in Thomas's eyes and knew this was it. This was the break. He pressed play. For the next 15 minutes, the only sound in the office was the hiss and whir of the tape, a sound from a bygone era carrying a message of fresh horror. Brody listened, his face hardening into a mask of granite. He heard the argument, he heard Lily's pleas, he heard the slap, the sickening crack, the final choked-off scream. He heard Richard's ragged breathing, and he heard Thomas's panicked flight. When the tape clicked off, the silence in the room was deafening. Brody didn't speak for a full minute. He just stared at the tape player as if it were a venomous creature. He finally looked up at Thomas, his eyes boring into him. "You've had this for 24 years. "I didn't know," Thomas whispered, the confession tearing from him. "I swear to God, Sheriff, I ran that night and I buried it. I buried it so deep, I forgot. The guilt, the fear, it made me forget finding her. It brought it all back." Brody wanted to be angry. He wanted to yell at this man for the years of silence, for the justice denied. But looking at Thomas's shattered face, he saw not a conspirator, but another victim. A man who had been living in a prison of his own making. "This changes everything," Brody said, his voice low and charged with a new, ferocious energy. "This is it." The plan was simple, brutal, and designed for maximum impact. A quiet arrest, a backroom deal that wasn't justice. Not for Lily. She deserved to have her truth told in the light, in front of the very people who had whispered about her and then forgotten her. The Vances had used the public sphere as their shield. Brody was about to turn it into a weapon. The next day was the hearing for the motion to release Lily's remains. The courtroom was packed. The local news was there, along with a few national reporters who had caught the scent of a bigger story. Eleanor and Richard Vance sat at the plaintiff's table, the picture of grieving dignity. Richard caught Brody's eye and gave him a small, smug nod, a victor acknowledging the vanquished. He had no idea what was coming. The judge, a portly man named Simmons who owed his position to the Vance's influence, called the court to order. He was about to grant the motion, his speech full of platitudes about closure and healing. "Before you rule, Your Honor," Brody said, standing up, "the Sheriff's Department has discovered new evidence in the murder of Lily Calloway. Evidence we believe the court needs to hear." The Vance's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. This is a procedural hearing, not a criminal trial. The sheriff is grandstanding." "I'll allow it," Judge Simmons said, intrigued despite himself. "But it better be good, Sheriff." "It is," Brody said. He looked over at Thomas, who was sitting in the back of the courtroom, his face ashen. Thomas gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. That was the signal. Brody walked to the clerk's desk and placed the cassette player on the ledge. "This is a recording made on the night of August 21, 1999. At the Founders' Day picnic, and in the adjacent Whisperwood Forest." A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. Richard Vance's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. Eleanor sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Brody pressed play, The sound of the picnic, the crickets, the young voices filled the tense, silent courtroom. People leaned forward, straining to hear. When Richard's voice, young and arrogant, came through the speakers, a collective gasp went through the room. "Good boy, Tommy, you know your place." Richard Vance went pale. He looked at his mother, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Eleanor's mask of composure finally shattered. Her face was a canvas of pure, undiluted panic. The recording played. On the argument. Lily's voice, so full of life and fire, pleading for her freedom. The crowd was mesmerized, horrified. They were no longer spectators. They were witnesses, transported back in time, standing in the dark woods with a killer and his victim. Women in the gallery began to weep quietly. Men shook their heads in disbelief. When the sound of the slap echoed through the courtroom, a woman in the front row cried out. Richard flinched as if he had been struck himself. He began to tremble, his carefully constructed world imploding in real time. And then came the final, terrible sounds. The crack, the cut-off scream, the heavy, ragged breathing of the killer. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence filled with 24 years of lies, of secrets, of justice denied. Every eye in the room was on Richard Vance. He broke. She wouldn't listen. He screamed, leaping to his feet. His face contorted into a mask of rage and self-pity. She was leaving me. She pushed me. It was an accident. I never meant to. I just wanted her to shut up. The confession, raw and unfiltered, hung in the air. His lawyer tried to grab him, to silence him, but it was too late. The dam had broken. Brody's voice cut through the chaos, cold and clear. Richard Vance, you are under arrest for the murder of Lily Calloway. 2 deputies moved in, pulling Richard's arms behind his back, the click of the handcuffs echoing like a gunshot in the stunned courtroom. The cameras flashed, a frenzy of light capturing the moment of his downfall. He was babbling now, a torrent of excuses and denials, but no one was listening. They had all heard the truth. Brody's gaze shifted to Eleanor. She was frozen, her face a death mask. Her son was being dragged away, her empire was in ruins, and her carefully crafted world had been annihilated by the voice of a dead girl on a cheap cassette tape. Brody walked over to her table. Eleanor Vance, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and accessory after the fact to murder. She didn't even look at him. She just stared straight ahead, at the empty space where her son had been, her entire life reduced to rubble around her. The cinematic payoff was complete. It wasn't just an arrest. It was a public exorcism. The poison that had infected Harmony Creek for a generation had been drawn out into the light. In the most explosive, public, and cathartic way imaginable. Lily Calloway, a girl who had been silenced and erased, had just delivered her own verdict. From the grave, and her voice had been loud enough to bring down a dynasty. The payback was not just legal, it was poetic. The town's prince had been dethroned in the very courtroom his family had owned. His downfall broadcast for the entire world to see. Justice, after a long and bitter slumber, had finally, violently, awoken. The fall of the House of Vance was swift and total. The trial was a formality. The tape was irrefutable. Richard's courtroom confession, a final nail in his own coffin. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Eleanor, refusing any plea deal, was convicted on all charges, her cold arrogance finally failing her as the judge handed down the maximum sentence. The Vance empire, built on generations of power and intimidation, crumbled into dust. The mill was sold off, the estate liquidated, the name becoming a synonym for disgrace. Harmony Creek breathed a collective sigh of relief. The kind that comes after a long and terrible fever has broken. The truth, as painful as it was cleansing. The whispers and suspicions were replaced by a shared, communal grief for the girl they had lost twice, once to a murderer, and once to a conspiracy of silence. A few weeks after the sentencing, the town gathered in the meadow where the Founders' Day picnics used to be held. The Vances' petition to claim Lily's remains had been dismissed, and her father, now a frail, white-haired man, stooped by a grief he had never fully allowed himself to feel, had finally brought his daughter home. They buried her in the town cemetery, under a simple granite headstone that read, "Lily Calloway, beloved daughter, finally at peace." After the funeral, a smaller group gathered in the meadow. The town council had officially renamed it Lily's Meadow. At the edge of the woods, near the path she had walked down on her final night, they planted a young dogwood tree. It was small and slender, but its branches reached towards the sun. Sheriff Brody was there, standing off to the side. He was retiring. At the end of the month, this case had been the bookends of his career, a long dark chapter that was finally closed. He felt a quiet sense of peace, but it was a peace tinged with the sorrow of all the lost years. He had gotten justice for Lily, but he couldn't give her back her life. He saw Thomas standing by the new tree, his hands in his pockets. The trial had been an ordeal for him. The Vances' lawyers had tried to tear him apart on the stand, painting him as an obsessed, unstable liar. But he had held firm, his voice never wavering as he told his story. The truth, his only shield. He had refused the offers for book deals and movie rights, wanting nothing more than to retreat back into his quiet life. The world saw him as the hero who had broken the case, but he knew the truth. He was the coward who had finally found his courage, 24 years too late. Brody walked over and stood beside him. They watched as Dr. Calloway placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the dogwood tree. "She would have liked this," Thomas said, his voice quiet. "She loved dogwoods. She would have liked that you told the truth," Brody replied. Thomas shook his head, a sad smile touching his lips. "I should have told it sooner. We all should have," Brody said. The words, a quiet confession. He had suspected Richard from day one. But he had let the Vances' power intimidate him, had let the lack of evidence become an excuse for not pushing harder. They had all, in their own ways, been complicit in the silence. They stood there for a while longer, two men bound by a shared history and a ghost they would both carry forever. The air in the meadow felt lighter now. The secrets that had once choked the town finally released. But the healing was bittersweet. It was a healing built on a foundation of immense loss. A young life, full of promise and light, had been extinguished. A father had lost his only child. A town had lost its innocence. And a boy had lost his best friend, and a piece of his own soul, in a moment of fear, as dusk began to settle. Casting long shadows across the meadow, Thomas walked to the edge of it. He looked towards the spot where the hollow giant stood, a dark silhouette against the fading light. The forensics team had recommended the tree be cut down, that it was a public hazard, but the town had refused. It was a monument now, a grim, silent reminder of the cost of secrets. It was a headstone for the truth itself, a testament to the fact that some things, no matter how deeply they are buried, will eventually find their way to the light. The story of Lily Calloway became a permanent part of the town's fabric, a cautionary tale whispered from one generation to the next. It was a story of love and betrayal, of power and corruption, of a truth that had been hidden in the heart of a hollow tree. The emotional echo of her life, and her death, would linger in Harmony Creek forever. It was a haunting reminder that the deepest wounds are not always the ones you can see, and that the heaviest silence is the one that holds a scream. The aftermath was not one of clean resolution, but of a long, slow, and painful healing, a bittersweet peace earned at an unbearable price. The ghost of Lily Calloway was finally at rest, but her memory would forever walk the quiet paths of Whisperwood. A tragic, beautiful reminder of the girl who had finally come home.